Doodle doo 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 doo. Secrets of Sea of Secrets. Greetings, I'm Demonac, and this is a little behind the scenes on Sea of Secrets, Episode 2, The Ugly Mug Inn. I think a couple of people were confused by the start of the episode, which surprised me a bit because I'm so accustomed to the conventions of television series, many of which do something like this, but I guess people don't expect a television series feel from random small YouTubers. A cold open is just an entertainment industry term for a segment of a show which plays before the audience is warmed up by your opening theme or title card. Hypothetically, a person could be tuning in and not even know what show was coming on, though I am assuming you clicked on SOS on YouTube, so I expect you to feel some degree of, this isn't what I expected to see, but to understand that it's part of the show you clicked on. The first episode of Sea of Secrets didn't have one. I needed to introduce the cast and start doing things as quickly as humanly possible because a person clicking on a new series has absolutely zero investment. And I need to get them interested enough in 15 to 30 seconds that they will watch at least the next 30 seconds, and so on. But first episode weirdness aside, I want to start SOS episodes with something a little different. In this case, a flashback to the backstory of one of the characters. And, as a storyteller, that flashback, or whatever else happens in the cold open, should theoretically provide valuable context to at least some part of the following episode. Though, when you first see it, when you come at it cold, the audience would have no idea why I chose to show them this little snippet. Of course, as you probably gathered from later in the episode, this particular memory isn't just from Blue's backstory. This is apparently one of his first memories of waking up in a laboratory floating in a tube, trapped, confused, and then, after being magically put to sleep by one of the racially diverse eye patch dudes, waking up again in the midst of chaos, where the whole place seemed to be coming apart. Chaos that he took advantage of to escape, starting a new life from nothing. Not even a past. Fun fact, when Blue uses his powers to smash open the cracked crystal tube, I was drawing out the cracks, trying to prepare to animate the many shards of glass breaking outward. And just to see what I was doing better, I started assigning semi-random colors to those shards, so no two adjacent pieces would be the same color. But once I had done that and separated them to layers, I kind of liked the effect. I was like, I need to show the power, emphasize the shattering. It's a cartoon. It's actually more artistic to keep these weird colors than to turn them all back to boring glass. So I left the colors in as a brief flash before they all glowed white and burst outwards towards the camera. Oh, and I love that I got Shane to make the Tales from My D&D campaign musical sting in Blues themes instruments. That would feel super classy if I hadn't just pointed it out and described it as classy. I hope the musical montage looked good. When I came up with the sequence, I loved it, and I spent way too long on it, but the result looks great to me. I don't like having a big chunk like that which doesn't work as a podcast for anybody just listening, but I went and did it anyway because it's cool. And, of course, because I wasn't talking during it, I spent even more time, because in my mind, the visuals had to justify its existence that much more, similar to how I keep sinking way more time than I should into basic conversation scenes because my gut tells me, I'm just showing these 2, 3, X people talking, I need to do more on screen. That's an instinct I really need to fight, but it's a fight I'm not winning yet, that's for sure. A regular, not extra emotional, conversation should be a place to make up time by animating less, but again, I need to work on that. This montage was the opposite though, and it shows. Describing it wouldn't improve it. Blue looks out the window at the strange triangular tower near the middle of Bankton. Jinx concentrates, scribbling out notes and drawings by candlelight on the desk of her room, her tongue hanging out as she focuses. She underlines a question about the symbol on one of the mech's shields, then pauses to yawn before buckling down to finish the thoughts before allowing herself to sleep. Adria checks that she isn't being followed before ducking into a questionable establishment, wherein she hands a sealed letter to the owner to deliver. Uhumisho sits cross-legged in his room, placing a large, strangely shaped tooth in the middle of a crude circle on the floor. Closing his eyes, he concentrates, and he and the circle glow. A translucent bullet, a land shark, the type of creature that tooth came from, emerges from the circle, growling, then leaps into Misho, where its form dissolves into strands, merging with him and forming the deadly claws of his soul meld. Palor stands in the early light which streams through his room's window, pulling his loose shirt on, which covers the red sun tattoo on the small of his back, matching the one on his left forearm. As the camera pulls back, movement at the bottom draws your attention to the naked form of a woman, seen from behind, as she watches him appreciatively. That's much less cool than showing it. Unless you were vision impaired, or just listening to the show while you do something else, then the descriptive video would really help. Sea of Secrets doesn't stick around in Bankton for long, because I've got to get the plot moving eventually. But the characters did have a little time to screw around, both while waiting the 2 hours for Jagad to be kidnapped, waiting for the meeting with Bayin, and also before calling it a night at the Crystal Umbrella Inn, after the dungeon. So when the game first started, that's actually where they got the exposition scene with the grapefruit, discussing the expedition to the Magic City. I rearranged that both because I settled on just before the rooftop meeting as my favorite place to start, and because I had a million things to draw for episode 1, so I wanted to put off drawing the glowing city in the geode. Also, it makes the grapefruit and the map referenced in episode 1 a bit of a tease, so that viewers might want to keep watching to find out about them. But after that exposition, Jagad was like, I want to squeeze in this one little meeting before the important one in 2 hours. I'll bring Boulder for protection. And Boulder's like, and that gave the PCs a couple hours to do any shenanigans they might have in mind. Uhumisho had theoretically been in Bankton for a few weeks, but the game starts here, so he goes out to take a look around the city. It's an interesting place because the human and halfling population is so mixed, pretty close to half and half. I'm less interested in the individual people than the city itself. As an animist, Uhumisho believes that almost anything you can name has a spirit, a character. A city may not be a literal being that you can talk to, but cities in particular are very much alive. They have circulation, they take in supplies, they produce things, they expel waste. They can expand over time, or sometimes parts of them might die off to rot and become mere skeletons, or perhaps to be reclaimed and grow back anew. That's what I want to get a sense of. Well, the city of Bankton has great wide streets radiating out from the center, bustling with people, and narrower alleys like spokes holding together those main roads. There are as many individual vibes as there are people, of course, but broadly speaking, there are two main currents. A swift and stressful current of busy people, mostly humans and halflings, rushing or moving goods from one place to another, and a slower, lazier river of people enjoying the sights, the architecture, and the museums, the many shops and restaurants. The rich and poor relax in different ways, often in different spots, but there's a commonality to those whose heads are high enjoying the city, just as there's a commonality among those whose heads are down trying to weave their way urgently through the throngs. A city with two spirits? No, it's muscle. There are two kinds of muscle tissue, the fast and the slow muscle. They serve different purposes, but real strength takes both kinds. Meanwhile, some of the others were wandering around, just poking about the market, where they ran across two merchants whose carts were parked next to each other, having a very loud argument about whose stuff was better. The halfling rug merchant is like, I have all these lovely flower patterns, right? You see this? 100 flowers here compared to 1 flower in your hand. And this lovely human flower merchant scowling down at him. This flower is alive and beautiful. You have no idea what beauty is. All your rugs are just... Every flower is the same. Every real bloom that grows is different. Ah, but your flower lasts about a day, a week. You buy this rug, you have it in your house for years. You give your woman a rug, and she will walk on it. You give her a flower, right? If you don't cut the flower, it lasts a long time.
I think I would go with the flower, but I don't think I'll have a place for it when we go on the road.
Then, after the whole dungeon, and then the invitation from the Illud embassy guard, prompting them to leave early in the morning, there wasn't really time to do anything, because they weren't going to get enough sleep as is. Except Adria, of course, because elves need a fraction of the time unconscious, including high elves like Adria, who I renamed Eladrin to the confusion of everybody who knows or cares about Eladrin in other D&D settings. But anyway, everybody should have been trying to get every second of sleep they could, if they were getting up early enough to pack up and set out before the gates open in the morning. So of course Pelor is like, I'll head down to the tavern downstairs, see if I can woo somebody. The tavern in the Crystal Umbrella is a little high-end, not sure if that's the kind of place you want. There are plenty of other establishments you could choose from. I'm a high-end dancer.
Are you gonna dance? Okay, well, after I finish writing my letter, I'm gonna go sing. I'll be your accompaniment. I'll sing something upbeat for you.
Well, I dance between the tables. Maybe on the tables. At first they get some odd looks, because, again, the Crystal Umbrella is more of a highbrow place. The atmosphere tends to be more sedate. But they have good skill checks, and while some people are grumbling, some are irrevocably uptight, others start paying attention, clearly enjoying the live entertainment. At least a couple ladies can't help but notice Pelor's athletic grace. I'm a high-end dancer. Then when Pelor did end up sharing a room for the night, Jinx joked out of character,
You don't know how tempted I am to change into a really hideous woman and bang on your door like, Pelor, what are you doing?
That would have been hilarious.
Now, we got into a bit of a thing about how long they would have to rest. Even aside from Jinx and Pelor burning an extra hour on entertaining the crowd, it had already been evening by the time they got back to the inn, and if the city gates reopened just after daybreak, they planned to be packed and in the wagon by then. Thing is, in D&D, it's supposed to take 8 hours of rest for casters to regain their spells, or in Blue's case, his psionic power points. You don't have to sleep every minute of that time. In fact, it's assumed that your typical long rest out in the field includes 4 party members, each taking a 2-hour watch. But while it's a little fuzzy by necessity on what is or isn't good enough rest, you're not supposed to be doing anything particularly active during the 8 hours, and especially not during the 6 hours, or 4 for elves, when you are sleeping, or your species' sleep analog. Even mechs, who can remain conscious 24/7, and are technically tireless in 3.5 edition, literally immune to fatigue and exhaustion, are still supposed to have that downtime if they want to regain spells or other daily abilities. Of course, a mech fighter might have no need for any of that, and be able to be active literally every minute of the day as far as rules are concerned. Regardless, though, over the course of the investigation and the dungeon, most of them had spent all their daily character resources, and some still needed healing, since the party has no healing classes, relying mainly on a pair of healing belts from Magic Item Compendium, which, to be fair, provide quite a lot of healing for reusable items that level 3 characters can afford to buy. I don't think Blue had a single power point left, despite the fact that his build gives him way more PP, and HP, than your average level 3 psionic character. On the other hand, he has some significant dump stats, including armor class, which is why he did not like the idea of going around with no points to defend himself. I'm basically useless without points. Now, based on their plan, they would be setting out hours before they would get their spells and stuff back, and the players were like, can we just heal and get our spells back anyway? And I, as GM, was like, nah, it's not enough time. But when you get some distance between you, Bankton, and these Illud who want to meet with you, then you guys can pull off the road, take a rest stop, and rest the other 3-4 hours. And Blue, I think those of you familiar with Little One from the original Tales from My D&D campaign will not be surprised. Blue was like, nope, I'm not going. I'll just sleep here in the fancy inn until my points come back. And they're all like, we'd be splitting the party. What if something happens? And he's like, if something happens to you and I have no power points, it doesn't matter if I'm there or not. I'll be just as helpful. And if they track me down here, that's my problem. I ain't getting up at 0 points o'clock. I'll catch up. And it was one of those things that prompted a lot of debate and consternation from the players, and then nothing happened, which is why it didn't make the video. The rest of them rode out, then camped out around noon, and by the time they were getting their spells back, Blue rode up on his brand new dog. See, the D&D books listed prices for modes of transport. Wagons, boats, draft horse, warhorse, ponies for small folk like halflings and gnomes. And then they had a price for riding dogs. So Blue's player was like, "Hell yeah, that sounds like fun. I'm gonna call her Black. Gonna ride this dog everywhere. I'm small, so with the dog, I'm about the same size as you guys. I'll ride her through the house. I don't give a shit." Then, years later, like a jackass, I go make a series and I have to figure out, how the hell do I draw a dog? Then a dog running. There's a goblin riding it. I'm not really a dog person, and I'm barely an animator. I don't do walk cycles. So I went down to the secret D&D animators Discord, where we all hang out, and there was like one person who was excited I was there. And everybody else is like, how is this guy able to make a living? All the other people who do this full time have 50 times as many subscribers. Thank you, patrons. But anyway, I hired Xanianator, who I've hung out with online a bunch. They have their own similarly small channel, and they're animating their own long-running campaign that they love. And I knew Xania is an actual animation professional who loves drawing animals, especially dogs, and is friggin' good at it. So I hired them to design Blue's dog and give me a few keyframes I could use to make the run cycle. Now, Xania's art is great. I just picked a dog breed, Burmese mountain dog, but with redder highlights because it's a fantasy world. They sketched it with Blue riding, all great stuff. The problem is, I can't just add in somebody else's animation unless they're doing it in Adobe Animate and in a fairly similar style to mine, lineless vector art at least. It doesn't matter how good it looks on its own if it's not going to blend in. The portraits from Archie Doodler were different because the plan was always for them to appear in frames. They don't need to blend. And similarly, the Palor dance sequence from Rag's animation was meant to be an insert shot, like a reused footage attack or transformation in an old anime show. Although I've slipped in the transparent version in a couple of specific places to save time, I really shouldn't. I need to avoid that whenever possible, other than the credits, because it doesn't quite match. It was never designed or intended to blend in. And so I definitely didn't want this dog riding animation to sit awkwardly as a different style. Like that thing in old cartoons where you could tell where the cliff was going to crumble away because the animated part of the cliff doesn't match the background part of the cliff. But that meant, instead of having Xania do the whole animation, which one assumes would be nicer and which would have saved me a ton of time, we could only go part way. Have them design and keyframe it for me, but then I had to trace my own vector art version over top and do the in-betweens myself. The effect is good. It's one of the better animations I have, to the point that it helps distract from my terrible, ugly horses in the travel sequences. But it did take me longer than I hoped and planned to get the right amount of fluidity between the keyframes, add smudge frames, and the extra bounce in the fur and ears to sell the sequence Xania had designed. I also simplified the eyes, because Xania went a bit more cartoony Disney eyes than I'm comfortable with for an ordinary animal. I'm not calling a dog Black in the show, though, because A, I'm not sure the player remembered the name or used it, and B, it could be confusing for people who know the previous series where one of the main characters was called Black. I'ma just call the dog Dog. I don't remember when I created the Ugly Mug Inn, but it was a long, long time ago. This busy, scruffy inn near the Tark-Laric border. I forgot which side of the border when writing my script and had to edit a map and re-record a line halfway through production when I actually looked at where it was on the high-quality Deathfin setting map. Good food, questionable booze, and a jerkhole owner who will, "We don't serve your kind here," certain less common, less humanoid species of sentient people. Trying to make the eponymous Ugly Mug sign for the Ugly Mug Inn was a bit of a challenge. Now, technically this is not a plot point, not even mentioned in the script, but supposedly the sign, which resembles a battered metal beer mug, has inspired much drunken debate over the face in the mug. Namely, if there is a face in the mug, and most people agree there is, where is that face? Which of the dents represent the eyes, and which dents make up the mouth? Or is the bent handle a scowling mouth? Thing is, not only did I need to achieve that description with my limited art skills, without going too far on the detail level, but I wanted to be able to transition from the bar owner's face to the mug logo. I had planned that from the start, so I had used that dwarf's head at an angle when drawing the image. But I actually forgot about that so far into the process of making the episode that when I did go back to add in that transition, I could not even remember how his face was supposed to line up with the dents in the mug. Though, I guess that suggests I did a decent job at making a face drunk people could argue about. Now, I had always planned, after the fast-paced first episode, to slow things down, spend some time with the PCs, at least most of them, in SOS number 2, because the stories mean more if you have a chance to connect with the characters. And I'm confident that when people come to the series later, this will feel right. But I do worry a little about losing people with the combination of slowdown, change in tone, and the time between episodes. When you get to the end of The Ugly Mug and can't just continue to the next episode right away, it was definitely a new experience for me to be not just keeping all these little social scenes, many of which don't feel like they advance the plot, but actually to expand on them. For example, the scene where Paylor wanted to pick up a friend for the night at last call, that discussion played out basically verbatim. That is exactly how it went at the gaming table. Though SOS has visual additions, like the one dwarf tearing off his shirt and really working those mischievous eyebrows. But the other Paylor scene, where the dwarven mercenary sat down with him, I wrote and added that to the video to enrich the setting, especially for new viewers not familiar with the Dwarves of Tark, and to give a little window into Paylor's character. At the table, it was really just a quick, bare-bones, out-of-character idea that Paylor would be happy to grab some mercenary work while in town to make some extra cash. But as we talked it out, we both agreed that there was no reasonable way for him to find, accept, and perform a job here in one night and still stick with the rest of the gang when they set out again the next morning. Which is why our himbo went back to his other recurring job, working the bar. Despite all the really good-looking scenes in this episode, the grapefruit reveal, the wordless montage, the travel animation with dog, Adria dodging the axe to color spray, the simple but effective water effects in the swimming pool atop the Illud embassy in Bankton. The standout scene to me is the rooftop conversation. And this is a case of the kind of thing I hope to do with this series. Did the two of them sneak up to the roof and roleplay a beautiful heart-to-heart in-game? Not exactly. I wrote that scene for the show, but it's me trying to adapt the things that did happen at the table while weaving in some of the information I know about their characters from the players, but which didn't necessarily come out in play. If you've ever made a D&D character with big dreams of what they would do, of what stories you could play out with them, you've probably also kicked yourself after a game night once or twice for not doing justice to the story in your mind, for failing to get it across in the moment because you got distracted by other parts of the game, forgot something, or were nervous and just kind of missed your moment. And one of my goals for Sea of Secrets is to weave the character narratives together more tightly, add some extra connections that might have been missing, and just make the best version of these characters and stories that I can without changing the events that actually happened at the table. So what was I working with here? Blue was an angry little guy with no memories before the lab. He kinda tried to murder a dwarf on a whim while everyone was distracted by the bar fight. Adria missed it, but Jinx spotted his attempt, and Blue saw her spot his attempt and left with the situation unresolved. Jinx chose not to tell anybody else. She did use a message spell to Adria, asking her to keep an eye out in case something happened to her, but Jinx didn't explain why. Somehow, what started as a reason for Jinx to distrust Blue, and vice versa, weirdly flipped into a connection between them, a sort of bond, and they began to trust each other more because of it. Jinx's default form is how she imagines she would look if she had been born a human. She doesn't like her natural, gray changeling form, and doesn't show it to anyone. So you can see, in this case, I didn't even really change things, so much as I wrote a scene, a conversation, that helped to encapsulate all this, and which helps to make sense of the way that the friendship between these two characters developed. And then I gave it an appropriate setting, and acted it as hard as I could, gave the conversation time to breathe, and maybe help viewers to feel a connection to one or both of them. I'm pretty proud of the result. Another goal I have for the series, of course, is to weave together the events of the plot into a more coherent story, which, in most cases, it was. Like, most of the things the players ran into were there for a reason, either based on or interfering with the plans of different factions, but for various reasons, when we played the sessions, the party didn't actually learn about most of these factions and connections. They kept doing things which resulted in them missing the clues I'd planned, and I was not quick enough at adjusting on the fly to get them this information anyway. And it just kept happening! Well, we'll see how much the party actually finds out in the show. After all, I'm not going to change the decisions they made. But even if they don't know what's going on under the hood, I have that other powerful tool of adaptation, bad guy vision. I can show you, the audience, the behind-the-scenes plotting and scheming of NPCs, villainous and otherwise. Now, this conversation at the embassy is barely even that. But I've had these characters, Ambassador Bolrod and his faithful guard Muguru, bouncing around in my head quite a long time, and I love KT politics. I love the verbal jousting and the clash of smug against smugness, so hopefully some of you enjoy it too. My awesome Patreon patrons get secrets videos about a week early so that I can answer some of their questions in this final video on YouTube, where I read the questions out in random, sometimes ridiculous voices. Like this. Mr. Nobody asked, "I'm curious about the noosphere you described, the realm of pure information and thought, and how it interacts with the magic and psionics of the setting. What would it be like to go there?" The Incarnum, I didn't name it, it's the name of the book Uhamisho's class comes from, isn't a place you can go. At most, it's a metaphorical realm, another of those less physical layers of reality. So, to actually explore it would be more like astral projecting through an endless maze of ideas and thoughts, emotions and dreams, the instincts and essences of all living things, of all things that have lived. Not their souls, their consciousness. That part moves on when they die. But everything they did, everything they lived, weaves into the fabric of the universe, a structure deeply tied to the astral plane. At which point, it suddenly makes a little more sense how Fey beings may access information they cannot possibly know, though it still does not explain their insights into future events, however flawed. However many fairy tales have a mortal triumph, because the Fey bargainer misinterpreted a vision or rhyme of what was fated to happen. Rinsaku Blade asked, "What is Kua political leadership like? It certainly seems like there is a set hierarchy between the politics and military. Is it similar to the ancient Romans, with high-ranking officials spending time in the army or commanding forces?" The centrality of the military within Kua hierarchy in both nations is more implicit than explicit. Each of the ruling houses, aka great houses, choose their representatives based on their own internal politics. In some clans, fighting, or more likely commanding troops, may be important, but most favor skill in their house's own areas of specialization, always combined with internal political ability, of course. So House Glidul's representative may not be a capable warrior at all, but rather an expert at fabric alchemy, or a particularly sneaky tailor. However, with both the Illud and Diluvians in a perpetual war with one another, the houses who contribute most to either direct combat strength, or to the parts of the economy most critical to sustaining the war effort, their representatives naturally get chosen as the most important ministers, and thus they tend to dominate the council. On the Illud side,
House Skolov are the main military experts. They run the Kua version of West Point, and have the strongest tradition as soldiers. House Unon is also a powerhouse, as the expert slave masters and breeders. They are critical to keeping up both the troop numbers and the agricultural laborers. And House Glidul are very strong, even though they are clothiers. The Kolos cloaks aren't as directly important to the underwater war, since even slave regiments will have Kua with them to spot invisible troops. But those alchemical cloaks are still a tremendous prestige item, supplied to important and wealthy Kua, to every scout, every soldier operating on land, and of course, to the monitors. And Glidul's array of other luxury fabrics earn them tremendous wealth, critical to maintaining trade balance with the surface nations, which in turn helps to keep the dwarven weapons flowing in. The Diluvian side works similarly, minus external trade of course, except that their council, who are still running everything, have to answer to the directives and whims of the Emperor, who is selected by the priesthood, usually based on a combination of martial valor, religious fervor, and of course, the will of Blibal, which helps ensure the forever wars that the goddess of slaughter demands. Rinsaku Blade also asked, "What is the political situation between the Illud and the other nations? Do they have any authority to operate within their allies' borders, or do their embassies just work through thinly veiled threats? How did the embassy in Bankton even come to be? It must have been hard to convince people to allow it to be built, to have Kua Toa walking freely around the streets." Nobody serious opposed the Illud embassy in Larik. It's very clear which side of the KT Civil War the surface nations are on, and prior to the conquest of Verandi, Larik was arguably the diplomatic center of the continent. That doesn't mean people were happy to see Illud walking the streets, but they're important allies, and individually pretty dangerous. They are stronger and much tougher than they look, even before the teeth, the fancy gear, etc. And that combination tends to keep incidents to a minimum. Of course, when neighboring Verandi was conquered, cutting off Vistria as well, Larik's many embassies suddenly felt a lot less relevant. The axis of politics on the continent really moved to Tark, Talaris, and Illud, and especially when Larik was forced to sign away their coast to the evil Diluvians in exchange for peace, the importance of the various human nations seemed to have waned. And that's when the Illud started to think of this embassy as a real backwater posting. Plus, the average citizen, not so well informed on world affairs, got a lot less friendly to seeing Kua around, even though these are Illud who hate the Diluvians who actually stole your fisheries, killed your grandpa in the war, or whatever. Larik aside, though, the Illud have strong, though not necessarily friendly, relations with the dwarves of Tark and the elves of Talaris, as well as the Eladrin, but they live in the Feywild, so they're both much less directly affected, and their aid is more logistically limited. They allied with the elves in particular before daring to even launch their rebellion against the Diluvian Empire. Without the powerful wizard Maghargrig and others backing them, including the implied but plausibly deniable approval of the king and queen, the Illud might never have tried to implement the conspiracy they'd been planning for decades. 3 centuries later, with the bloody Kua Toa civil war still raging, many elves are less enthusiastic about the very long and expensive support they have been giving to the Illud cause, though reportedly King Dietrich, known for both stubbornness and for his long-term perspective, still firmly believes that the battles up and down the Leviathan are the only thing keeping Diluvian warriors out of the Verdualen. Obviously the elves of Talaris are committed at this point, so they do a lot of trade with the Illud. Most importantly, trade in magical resources, but also paper, rope, and other things. And they do everything they can to keep that international relationship strong, without exposing themselves to too much perceived risk of Diluvian retribution,
or leaving themselves too open to infiltration by their Illud allies. Over the 3 centuries the Illud Republic has existed, every year of which they've been in an existential battle against their imperial brethren, the understanding that has evolved between these rebels and their allies is that the Illud's invisible spies and monitors do not perform operations within the territory of their surface allies. But those silent forces have to be there to counter the Diluvian scouts and monitors who are under no such limitation. Though the understanding is largely unspoken, especially in public, the elves, dwarves, and other surface nations accept that their aquatic allies are spying on them all the time, all over the continent. It's inevitable, as long as the Illud don't take it any further. No infiltration and manipulation of political or military structures, no sabotage, no assassinations. Then the surface dwellers have to consider it the cost of doing business, the cost of protection from their equally invisible enemies. Now, this is pragmatic. It makes sense. But if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, you will see the problem. We know both Illud and Diluvians have these shadowy elite forces. They operate unseen in the cities, on the roads, the ports. They could be almost anywhere. We know that Diluvian spies are not just observing the land dwellers, not just hunting the Illud, but they could also be committing assassinations and sabotage to try to reduce the aid being provided to the Illud. So when an invisible fish person kills a politician, maybe a vocal anti-Illud leader, how do you know which side of that species did it? It's probably the bad guys trying to make it look like the good guys did it. But is that true every time it happens? How would you even know? So the whole enterprise hinges on the allies trusting the Illud not to abuse their trust, which makes for a very uncomfortable situation, even ignoring the constant spying, which is officially not allowed, but which the Illud are definitely doing. Everybody knows that, except for the diplomats on both sides, who are very politely certain that the Illud do not spy on allies. Then there are personal relations, because these groups don't just relate as abstract nations, but as thousands upon thousands of individual Kua, elves, dwarves, humans, halflings, and hundreds of others. To paint with a very broad brush, elves and Illud tends to interact quite formally. Elves tend to be polite and distant, trying to hide their distrust or even distaste that many of them have for a people many of them consider to be monsters. Not because of their scales or their huge toothy maws or the frightening power of their warrior monks. Elves and many others consider the Illud monstrous because when they rebelled against the Empire, they failed to free their slaves. They still rely on that most disgusting of institutions. And the Illud, in general, are quite decent at being polite and diplomatic in return, but both sides tend to remain pretty frosty. By contrast, most dwarves hate Kua Toa, including the Illud. They barely hide it. Hell, they almost seem proud of it. They do business left and right, on a much larger material scale than elf-Illud trade, selling mostly metalworks, which dwarves famously excel at, and which also happen to be inconvenient to produce underwater. And between that trade in the ports and the Illud military envoys advising and assisting in the protection of dwarven shipping down the Diamond Coast, a higher proportion of dwarves are in frequent contact with the Illud compared to elves. But if you've ever spent time with dwarves, you may have noticed that some dwarves form what you might call hate friends. Two dwarves from opposing clans, or who are heated business rivals, or who have explosive arguments about one topic or another, like the old axe or hammer weapon debate, sometimes form a bond over something else they have in common, or even seemingly over their difference, over the arguments themselves. You might see the pair walking together, raging and insulting each other, and yet you see them together in the pub later. and again the next day, and the day after. They might seem almost inseparable. A pair who can drink together loudly or silently with equal companionship. Though Kua don't tend to bond with each other in that particular way. The close contact between Illud envoys and dwarven military, or between merchants of the two species, has resulted in many pairs of Illud dwarf hate friends, which the fish people seem to find quite entertaining, even endearing. It might seem strange to an outsider looking in, but on a personal level, this raw and honest, antagonistic form of relation suits most Illud better than the relentless but shallow politeness of most of their elven allies. Rex asked,
Wasn't Olundo the envoy who was assigned down near Ginneron to the Don whose lands were washed over by the Astral Plague? If so, how has he survived the plague?
Actually, the envoy present during the Ginneron incident in original TDDC, the one who would have been hit by the plague, was recalled. At least, that's the official word. It's most likely they simply died, but that the Illud government either had no idea why or covered it up, because secrecy is their default state of being. Envoy Olundo would be the replacement for that official, though I believe Bob's warning letter did arrive before Olundo actually arrived in their new post, possibly before they were even appointed to the role.
Rex also asked, Are trolls immune to the Astral Plague? If so, then wow. If not, what happened to the two trolls whose jaws were on Little One's shield during the portal explosion? They should have been irradiated, but then the party just released them into the peace bond.
It's unclear whether the Astral Plague would just get regenerated away by the Deathfin setting's super trolls, or whether it might mess them up permanently, like some permanent magical, not physical, decay. But I don't think that Little One's trolls would provide a definitive answer either way, because their bodies weren't present at all, only the jaws, and troll jaws in our world are indestructible. So even if a flesh and blood troll might have been messed up by the Astral Plague, I think that while their bodies have been destroyed, while their souls are stored entirely inside the indestructible jaws, it would just wash over them. There's no tissue to infect. Grim Reaper asked,
Has Blue ever visited the Psionic Academy? Also, I'm curious, with all the various magic systems involved now, how are you handling loot? I'd imagine psionic items are a bit uncommon outside this area. The same with Incarnum-based items.
Well, for most purposes, magic items are magic items in this setting. If you get a +1 enhancement bonus to AC, it doesn't matter whether it comes from arcane or divine magic, psionics, or Incarnum. Obviously, it does matter in the case of enchanted gear that interacts with your class abilities, like spellcasting. Basic +2 stat items work for anybody, but nothing in the basic Dungeon Master's Guide is going to grant Blue extra powers known, or give Uhamisho more essentia to invest into his soul melds. A sentence that sounds like utter gibberish to the average D&D enjoyer who hasn't really gotten their head around the Magic of Incarnum third-party rulebook for 3.5 edition. Psionic gear is actually at least as common as arcane stuff throughout Laric. It is, after all, the former territory of the ancient Adar, renowned masters of the mind. Such items are certainly less common elsewhere, but they should still be around. Both Illud and Diluvian monitors have been known to use some psionics to increase their options in combat. Incarnum-specific gear is probably more on the rare side, if for no other reason than the magic item section of that book is extremely bare bones. Fortunately, Misho's focus is melee combat, and Even though he uses soul meld claws rather than weapons, there should be no shortage of loot to help a hero deal and survive damage in melee. Has Blue ever dealt with the Psionic Academy? There's actually a brief scene I wanted to flash back to, but I haven't found a good place for it in the series. It lost out to escaping the tube for his backstory cold open. Spoilers if I do find a way to work it in later, but honestly, as they travel further east, this scene becomes less and less relevant. I recognize that lady's brooch, that brain on shield symbol. Shortly after I entered the city, I turned down a side street and ran into an old halfling wearing one of those. He said, "Welcome, I'm blah 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 of the Psionic Academy." Wait, his name was blah blah blah? I don't remember his name. Anyway, we take note of psychic individuals in Bankton. What, is having powers a crime? Far from it. You have a talent, a gift. I came to offer you a place in the academy, if you want it. Training, support, lodgings, pants. You weren't wearing pants? Why is everyone obsessed with pants? Not like I've got anything going on down there. So I'm like, and what if I say no? Nothing. We advocate to protect psionic individuals and the greater community, members or not. But to that end, I must note, if you use your powers to assault or charm anyone, or to commit other crimes in this city... Right on cue, a half-dozen people in blue hooded robes revealed themselves on the rooftops, looking down on me. The Academy assists the authorities in dealing with powerful criminals. Yeah, I get it. Aside from that, if you need any assistance, the offer remains open. Our campus is easy to find. And he pointed at that tower near the center of town. The one with the weird triangle window. Did they all levitate up there like Bayen? How should I know? I severely doubt it. That's too many powerful casters posing just to intimidate one visitor. I would have just jumped up. Now I'm just imagining them all climbing back down a ladder afterwards. Good job, team. I bet we looked really cool. If you're watching us, I'm sure you already liked and subscribed, but if you want to make sure you don't miss SOS episodes when they drop, even YouTube's notification bell often fails. For that extra notification, and whatever random day-to-day posts I make, you could join my Discord with piles of other TDDC enjoyers, or follow me on social media. You can find me on whatever site, Shitter, Blue Sky, Tumblr, etc., by going to demonac.com/name of site, like demonac.com/discord, or demonac.com/threads, all lowercase. Sea of Secrets Episode 3 is coming, funded, as always, by my patrons at patreon.com/demonac. They are the ones who allowed me to make this my full-time job a few years ago. In addition to getting some of their questions answered publicly in these videos, they also get the Strange and Epic Hammer and Smoke D&D campaign podcast, which won't go published till I finish the season sometime in the distant future. Plus, the hopefully ironically named Demonac is Boring Casual Podcast, which is just for patrons. And if you want more animated D&D while waiting for my slow ass, don't forget to check out Rags Animation's Prepare to Dice series for a very silly, very animated campaign, and Zanionator's D&D story for more of an emotional, character interaction-based show. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout-out to Aether Mordu, Administrator Orange, Andrew Drake, Alberio, Oust, Aurelius, Bedimir, Bessie, Captain Rook, Brethren, Tarnlin, Critical Hit 20, Darkwood, Dimmin, Dragonloot, Draugr, Earl of Sanguine, Eckardir Thalion, Fey Crossroads, Fireborn, Gator Island, Fright Knight, Gorefiend, General M.O., Nine, Hakoon, Lieutenant Red, Lonito, Lord Avon, Malison Desh, Matt the Mage, Marge Project, MG3D, Norgren, OI1, Olden Man, Overlord Thor, Pedrig of Rooney, Pontus, Quackers, Ramar Ulfist, Retmok, Rex, Rewoot, Skyder97, Stan the Man, Starfall, Cygax, Tambo and June, Toshiro7, Volkfang, Valis, WA Soul, Warsaw, Woodley, and Zombie. The members of the organization.